I am not afraid of Donald Trump. I am not afraid of the Republicans. And we're going to hold their feet to the fire. I am actually excited about this opportunity.
That was Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer back in 2017 before President Donald Trump assumed office. And as you all saw, he assured us that the Democratic Party was going to be a force to be reckoned with in Congress. In fact, he was excited to have the opportunity to hold Donald Trump and the Republican Party accountable. But here we are now, 1 year later, and after a massive standoff with the Republican Party during a government shutdown, when they had leverage with the American people on their side, they still caved within days. And this isn't the first time that they caved, as you all know, but I mean, they were truly in an advantageous position where they could have not only fully funded the government for a year if they fought a little bit harder, but they also could have gotten all of the policy concessions that they wanted. They could have showed strength for the first time in decades, but they didn't. They chose to cower in fear to Republicans instead, like they usually do. Now, it would be one thing if Democrats were just too scared to stand up to Republicans, but they're not just cowards. They're also enabling Donald Trump and the Republican Party in dangerous ways. Just last week, 55 House Democrats, including Minority Speaker Nancy Pelosi, voted to expand Donald Trump's ability to spy on American citizens without a warrant. And in the Senate, 18 Democrats voted to prohibit debate on that same bill. They didn't even want to discuss it. They just wanted an up or down vote, and this includes Claire McCaskill, Joe Manchin, Amy Klobuchar, and Sheldon Whitehouse. And in addition to these Democrats, Tammy Duckworth, someone who's usually progressive, also went along with Democrats who enabled Donald Trump. And ironically enough, after proposing to curtail the government's ability to spy on Americans, Dianne Feinstein also went along with this as well. And I wish I could tell you that that was the only area in which Democrats enabled Donald Trump and went along with Republicans, but it's not. As the New York Times reports, Democrats are adding momentum to the Republican Party's push to deregulate the same banks that crashed the economy in 2008. They report, quote, a group of Senate Democrats has joined Republicans to support legislation that would mark the first major revision of the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act, a signature accomplishment of President Barack Obama that has been deemed a disaster by President Trump. The bill would allow hundreds of smaller banks to avoid certain elements of federal oversight, including stress tests, which measure a bank's ability to withstand a severe economic downturn. Under current law, banks with assets of $50 billion or more are considered systemically important financial institutions and therefore governed by stricter rules. The bill would raise that threshold to institutions with assets of $250 billion or more, leaving fewer than 10 big banks in the United States subject to stricter oversight. That's what Democrats are doing. That's how they're resisting Donald Trump. And I know that by now, by the time you guys see this video, you're already sick and tired of hearing about the government shutdown, but I do think it's important that we talk about what happened because it serves as a really important example, if not the best example, as to how Democrats fundamentally misunderstand what it means to resist. And by now, you all know that before the government even shut down, Democratic Senator Dick Durbin took to Twitter to actually boast about their willingness to cave to Republicans and give them everything that they were asking for. And even though negotiations ultimately fell through and the government did shut down for 3 days, well, Chuck Schumer made it clear that it was their intent to cave all along.
The president demanded for months that a deal on DACA include the wall. Most of we Democrats don't think the wall is effective. We think it's expensive. But because the president campaigned on the wall, even though he said it'd be paid for by Mexico, and demands the wall for the sake of compromise, for the sake of coming together, I offered it. The president picked a number for a wall. I accepted it. Wasn't my number. Wasn't the number in the bills here. He picked it. Now, it would be hard to imagine such a more reasonable compromise. All along, the president's saying, well, I'll do DACA and Dreamers in return for the wall. He's got it.
So make no mistake about it, they were willing to cave from the minute they had any inkling that the government might possibly shut down. So in the end, they agreed to go along with Republicans to temporarily fund the government for 3 weeks. in order for the government to be reopened. So what did they win? Did they get anything besides just embarrassing themselves? Well, I'll let disgraced former DNC chairwoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz explain specifically what they got.
So the one thing I would say that he did get is the potential for momentum.
What the hell did you just say?
The potential for momentum. Then
I'm
maybe
still-
we
I'm
can
sorry.
be in a position to
I'm
get
still
the
hung
House
up.
and the president to come
Congresswoman,
on board.
I'm still hung up, though, and I know Americans are listening, and they heard you say, and it's reverberating, potential for momentum, and they're thinking,
Yeah,
potential for momentum, was that really worth shutting the government down for? The
What-
potential for something.
I will tell you that Republicans should be asking themselves that question because they shut the government down.
So the Democratic Party got the potential for momentum, according to Debbie Wasserman Schultz. That's what they won by giving to Republicans, the potential for momentum. God forbid they actually have real momentum, but they got the potential for momentum, everyone. However, Vox journalist and Democratic Party apologist Ezra Klein tells us that the Democratic Party didn't actually cave at all. In fact, this was a victory for them because they secured funding for the Children's Health Insurance Program for the next 6 years, and now Republicans can no longer use that as a bargaining chip and argue that Democrats are holding children's health insurance hostage because they support undocumented immigrants' rights. So that's a really, I guess you could say, glass half full, optimistic way of looking at things, but anyone can see that this was not a win for Democrats because they face the possibility of another government shutdown in 3 weeks, and their basically ability to protect Dreamers at this point is all based on a promise from an infamous liar, Mitch McConnell. So if Mitch McConnell decides to go back on that promise, Dreamers get no protection. And the fact that funding for CHIP is considered a win in the first place alone demonstrates just how weak Democrats are because they let a bipartisan law become a partisan political issue in the first place. Had they hammered Republicans for refusing to fund CHIP, they wouldn't even be having this discussion in the first place. But again, they refused to fight as usual. And now, Dreamers are forced to rely on the word of one of the most notoriously corrupt senators in the country, Mitch McConnell. If he decides to go back on his promise, what do Dreamers get? Nothing. So, Democrats caved. I don't know how you could possibly do mental gymnastics and frame it in any other way, but the saddest part is that Democrats didn't have to cave. They didn't have to take that minor concession that was funding for CHIP because they had Republicans backed into a corner. In fact, just last year, I played this clip last week on the show, Donald Trump admitted that he would be willing to shut down the government in order to get funding for his border wall.
Now, the obstructionist Democrats would like us not to do it, but believe me, if we have to close down our government, we're building that wall.
We have to close down our government, we're building that wall.
Gotcha, bitch.
You got him. That's it. You win this argument. The American people will know who chose to shut down the government. And if that wasn't enough, Donald Trump blabbed on Fox News repeatedly that whenever there's a government shutdown, he knows who to blame. It's always the president.
If there is a shutdown, I think it would be a tremendously negative mark on the President of the United States.
Who's getting fired? Who's going to bear the brunt of the responsibility if indeed there is a shutdown of our government?
Well, if you say who gets fired, it always has to be the top. I mean, problems start from the top, and they have to get solved from the top, and the president's the leader, and he's got to get everybody in a room, and he's got to lead. You know, the interesting thing is in 25 years and 50 years and 100 years from now, when the government is, you know, they talk about the government shutdown, they're going to be talking about the President of the United States. Who was the president at that time? Mm-hmm. They're not going to be talking who the head of the House was, the head of the Senate, who's running things in Washington. So I really think the pressure is on the president.
Gotcha, bitch.
So that right there was a gigantic gift that Donald Trump handed to Democrats and basically assured them that in the event of a government shutdown that lasts for weeks potentially, they're not going to get any blame for it. In fact, polls indicate that Americans actually did blame Donald Trump and the Republicans for the shutdown. And even in the event Donald Trump hadn't blabbed about a shutdown, it would have been evident that Republicans were to blame, seeing that this is the first time in American history that the government has ever shut down when one party was in control of all branches of government. But in spite of all of that, in spite of the multitude of reasons they had to hold strong, they chose to cave, and they did not hold strong for Dreamers. I mean, they could have held out a little bit longer to secure protections for Dreamers so that way they don't have to wait 3 more weeks to wonder if they're going to be able to stay in the country that they grew up in. Democrats chose to cave, even though they had Republicans backed into a corner, because you can't take any chances. I mean, especially during an election year if you're Democrats, right? President Donald Trump said that Democrats care more about illegal immigrants than our military. So of course, since Donald Trump said mean things about them and the Republican Party said mean things about them, they had to back down. You can't take any chances, right? Except they had them cornered on that framing of the issue as well, because Democrats actually I'm surprised they were able to do this. They got Republicans to show their cards. So here is Claire McCaskill asking for funding for the military to make sure that the government shutdown doesn't affect them. And then watch what Mitch McConnell says.
I was most disappointed tonight when the President of the United States put out a statement that tried to divide us based on party when it came to support of our military. There is no such division. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 36, H.R. 1301, that the amendment at the desk for continuing appropriations for pay and death benefits for members of the armed services be considered and agreed to, the bill as amended be considered read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. We passed similar legislation during the government shutdown back in 2013. My hope is that we can restore funding for the entire government before this becomes necessary. I'm going to object for tonight, but we'll discuss again tomorrow. Therefore, I object.
Objection is heard.
Gotcha, bitch.
So there you have it. Mitch McConnell said publicly that he objects to a measure that would make sure the military still gets paid during the shutdown. You got him. It's over. You're holding them accountable right there. And I actually did have a glimmer of hope for a second that Democrats would hold strong based on their rhetoric, because this is how Tammy Duckworth responded to Donald Trump's claim that Democrats don't care about the military.
I spent my entire adult life looking out for the well-being, the training, the equipping of the troops for whom I was responsible. Sadly, this is something the current occupant of the Oval Office does not seem to care to do. And I will not be lectured about what our military needs by a 5-deferment draft dodger. And I have a message for Cadet Bone Spurs. If you cared about our military, you'd stop baiting Kim Jong-un into a war that could put 85,000 American troops and millions of innocent civilians in danger.
So make no mistake about it, that right there is how you show force and stand strong. So kudos to Tammy Duckworth for actually standing up to the president. If only she displayed that same level of courage and stood up to him before voting to expand his ability to spy on Americans, then, I might actually take her seriously. But at the end of the day, Democrats did what we all expected them to do. They rolled over and died. They caved. But thankfully, not all Democrats were spineless. Some Democrats actually did stand up to Donald Trump and the Republicans, and they were willing to fight a little bit longer for Dreamers. That includes, expectedly, the progressive wing of the party, like Bernie Sanders, Jeff Merkley, and Elizabeth Warren. They weren't willing to cave right away, but even big talkers like Claire McCaskill and Tammy Duckworth decided to cave at the first chance they got. And what's the end result?
The potential for momentum.
Besides getting the potential for momentum, they ended up pissing off progressives. They aggravated media outlets that actually tend to give Democrats more favorable coverage, like Slate, and Donald Trump is now basically rubbing it in their faces that they caved. And what makes this even more absurd is that when Republicans shut down the government in 2013 because they were demanding that Obama not provide funding for the Affordable Care Act, they knew they were going to lose. That was inevitable, but yet they still held strong for 16 days. But here in this situation, Democrats actually had a chance to get real policy concessions to protect dreamers, to fund the government for a year, and they caved after 3 days, not even 3 full days, mind you. 2.5 days, basically. So in an interview on CNN with Anderson Cooper, Bernie Sanders lays it out really clearly as to why holding strong was a no-brainer.
I think what is going on, to me, is very clear. That the Republicans really want to shut down the government for whatever reason. Where we are, Anderson, is not complicated. As you know, in the United States Senate, you need 60 votes to pass this budget resolution. Mitch McConnell doesn't have 60 votes. He doesn't have it. He knows he doesn't have it. The option that he has now is to say, okay, I don't have the 60 votes. Let us sit down and negotiate. Let us work in a nonpartisan way to address the crises facing this country. Last night, you may have heard this, we received a tweet from the Pentagon. And what the Pentagon told us is they need a fully funded fiscal year 2018 budget or face ramifications for our military. This is the Pentagon. They cannot function on a month-to-month basis. We are a $4 trillion government. We need to have an annual budget because what's going on now is very, very dangerous and wasteful for our country. Many, many crises that have not even been addressed. We cannot keep kicking the can down the road.
Well, the Republicans, obviously, and the White House are saying, well, look, it's the Democrats who seem to want to shut down that by forcing the issue on immigration on DACA, which is something that could be done a week from now.
That is not true. Here, again, is the situation, and let the viewers make their decision. Mitch McConnell does not have 60 votes. And if he goes forward tonight at 10 o'clock, as I understand he will lose. Therefore, the government will shut down. Understanding that, what a rational person who does not want to shut down the government does is say, okay, I don't have the 60 votes. I can't do it alone with the Republicans. We have to sit down and negotiate. What do you want? Let's go forward. That is what has to happen. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, I mean, they may think politically that a shutdown works to their benefit. You'll remember way back when the president, Donald Trump, was talking about how maybe the country needs a good government shutdown. I don't know. But I think it will be a very unfortunate thing. McConnell has got to start negotiating. And it's not just about DACA. We are 3.5 months into the fiscal year. 3.5 months. We still don't have an annual budget. You know what that means? It means 27 million people in community health centers have not received refunding, the new funding authorization. It means that 30,000 vacancies at the Veterans Administration are still not filled. It means we have a heroin and opioid epidemic sweeping this country. We are not addressing it. We have a collapsing infrastructure. We are not addressing it. So we have real work to do, and we can't simply have a dysfunctional government which doesn't address our problems and passes a continuing resolution month by month by month.
Yet here we are, facing another possibility of a shutdown in 3 weeks and potentially a shutdown after that if Congress agrees to another stopgap funding measure to temporarily fund the government. So, I mean, at the end of the day, this is tiring. The Republican Party, they're bullies. And the reason why they bully Democrats is because it's a tactic that works. They get what they want. And the only way you deal with a bully is by standing up to that bully. But what do Democrats do? They run and hide. They retreat. They never have the courage to hold strong. So we'll see in 3 weeks whether or not Democrats actually do hold strong. Chuck Schumer is now talking big again. He's saying that he's withdrawing the wall as an option. So will they hold strong in 3 weeks? Probably not, but I hope they actually prove me wrong. I'd love to come out and say, I stand corrected. Democrats held strong for once, but yeah, I'm not too optimistic about that. But at least they got the potential for momentum, right? This segment of the Humanist Report was brought to you by 7coffeeroasters.com. They're a minority-owned small business in Seattle, and they specialize in roasting unique and delicious coffee that's not actually roasted until you've placed your order. And the best part is that they actually ship out all orders within 24 hours, so you get your coffee and it still tastes fresh when it arrives. And to boot, they're also a progressive company that pays their workers a living wage and actually cares about the country. So to support them and experience the deliciousness of their coffee, you can check out 7coffeeroasters.com.